Most people think money problems begin with arithmetic. They think the problem is a bad formula, a missing spreadsheet, a salary that is too low, a portfolio that is too small, a lack of sophistication, a lack of access, a lack of IQ. I have never believed that. I think most money problems begin with confusion about what money is for. That is a much deeper problem. If you think money is a scoreboard, you will never have enough. If you think money is a costume, you will keep renting identities you cannot afford. If you think money is mainly for proving something, then every financial decision becomes tangled up with ego comparison, insecurity, and performance. That is where the trouble begins. Money is a very good servant. It is a terrible master. It can lower stress. It can buy time. It can reduce dependence. It can give you room to think. It can let you say no. It can protect your family in bad weather. It can create optionality. It can buy peace. Those are wonderful uses, but once you ask money to become your identity, your self-worth, your emotional ranking, it starts controlling you. And people controlled by money can make a great deal of it and still live like frightened prisoners. That is one of the saddest things I have seen. I have watched people earn incomes that would have seemed extraordinary to them 10 years earlier, and yet behave as if they were barely hanging on. I have watched people with very little act freer than people with enormous balance sheets. I have watched wealthy people who look trapped and modest people who look peaceful. That tells you something important. The real subject is not only how much money you have. The real subject is your relationship to it. The source you gave me circles around this truth repeatedly. It says financial independence exists on a spectrum, that every dollar saved is a piece of your future you control, that happiness is the gap between expectations and reality, and that visible richness is not the same thing as actual independence. That is exactly right. Now let me tell you what I think money should be. Money should be a tool for independence. That is not a glamorous answer. Good. Glamour is usually where people get into trouble. I do not want money because I need applause. I do not want money so that strangers can be impressed. I do not want money so that I can keep score against people whose values I do not even respect. I want money because I like autonomy. I like waking up and doing what makes sense instead of what desperation requires. I like knowing that if the world becomes foolish, I can be patient. I like having enough cushion that I do not need to sell my judgment to survive the month. That is wealth. Not the car, not the house, not the restaurant bill, not the vacation photo, not the visible theater freedom. That is what I have always wanted from money. And the funny thing is that once you understand that, a great many financial questions become easier. The first thing that changes is how you think about saving. Most people have been taught to think of saving as delayed gratification. They hear that phrase and they imagine a joyless exchange. You deny yourself something fun today so you can maybe enjoy something bigger tomorrow. That is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. It misses the deepest emotional reason to save. Saving is not only about a future purchase. Saving is about current independence. The source says this beautifully when it explains that every dollar saved is a piece of your future you own. A little more comfort when you get laid off, when your car breaks down, when a medical emergency appears, when some disruption arrives that you did not schedule. That is the right way to see it. If I save $100, I have not merely postponed pleasure. I have purchased $100 of less fear, $100 of less dependence, $100 of more room. That room has value right now, not just later. It changes how you sleep tonight. It changes how you think tomorrow. It changes how fragile your life is this week. A lot of people ask, what is the point of saving $20 from each paycheck if it is not enough to make me rich? That question sounds practical. It is actually philosophical. It assumes that unless the amount transforms your status entirely, The amount does not matter. That is foolish. Independence is not black and white. It is not filthy rich or nothing. It is a spectrum, and every dollar you save moves you, even if only slightly, toward greater control. That is exactly what the source argues. It pushes back against the idea that if a person cannot save massive amounts, then saving is meaningless. Instead, it says each small amount creates marginally more comfort and future control. That is a powerful idea because it makes saving emotionally rational for ordinary people. The problem with most financial messaging is that it accidentally flatters extremes. Either you are building immense wealth or you are wasting your time. Either you are crushing it or you are failing. Either you are a millionaire or your $20 does not count. Nonsense. The person who saves $20 is doing something very important. He is changing his identity from someone who consumes everything to someone who retains some claim on the future. That is not trivial. That is the start of everything. A small habit repeated long enough becomes structure. Structure matters more than motivation. Motivation is a fair weather friend. Structure survives ugly months. Structure survives disappointment. Structure survives stress. This is why I have always preferred automatic saving to heroic saving. The source says the same thing in practical terms, describing savings as a real expense, like rent or food, and urging that it be automated whenever possible. Exactly. If saving depends on your mood, it will fail the moment life becomes inconvenient. Life becomes inconvenient on schedule. So the money should move before you have the chance to negotiate with yourself. That is wisdom. You do not need to be dramatic. You need to be repeatable. Now let me discuss the thing that ruins more financial lives than lack of intelligence ever has. Expectation. I think expectation is one of the most underappreciated forces in all of finance. People assume they are unhappy because the number is too small. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes the number is genuinely too small for the needs of life. But often the misery comes from a different place. The misery comes from the gap between what they have and what they think they are supposed to have. The source says it plainly, all happiness is the gap between expectations and reality, and the wider the gap, the more miserable a person will feel. That is one of the deepest truths in the whole subject, because once you understand that, you stop assuming every financial pain is solved by earning more. A lot of financial pain is caused by standards that spiral out of control. A person rents an apartment that is a little too nice because he thinks that is where he should be. He dresses beyond his budget because that is how he imagines a successful person should look. He travels in ways he cannot afford because that is the life he believes he should already have. He eats out too much, upgrades too early, finances too casually, and then wonders why he never has enough left to save. The source describes exactly this trap, saying that many people spend too much over many years because they are chasing who they think they should be, rather than living at the level they can honestly afford. That is not a small insight. It explains why so many people feel perpetually behind. They are not only trying to build a life, they are trying to inhabit an identity. Identity is expensive. A lot of debt is really identity debt. A lot of overspending is really insecurity with a receipt. A lot of financial stress is really expectation mismatch wearing the costume of bad luck. Again, I am not denying that luck matters. It does. Housing costs can be brutal. Medical bills can be brutal. Children are expensive. Recessions happen. Jobs disappear. The source is careful to acknowledge that empathy matters and that many people truly are facing tougher conditions than previous generations in things like home ownership and retirement pressure. That empathy is important. Financial life is not fair, but empathy should not blind us to the other side of the equation. A great many people are struggling not only because life got expensive, but because their expectations kept climbing in lockstep with every little bit of progress. That is a killer. You earn more. Now more feels necessary. You upgrade something. Now the upgrade becomes normal. You hit a target. The target dissolves. Then you chase the next one. This is the moving goalpost problem. The source invokes this directly, drawing on the idea that one of the hardest financial skills is getting the goalpost to stop moving. Exactly, if the goalpost never stops moving, then no amount of progress will feel like security. It will feel like maintenance. A person who lives this way can become financially larger and emotionally poorer at the same time. He has more. He feels less. That is the curse of endless comparison. And the world now has built an entire industry around keeping that comparison alive. Social media is not a neutral tool in money. It is an expectation amplifier. The source hints at this in a smaller way when it talks about the social algorithm and using outside signals as your yardstick. That is exactly right. A lot of people no longer judge their life against their own values. They judge it against a feed, against strangers, against edited lives, against staged success, against people who may be drowning in debt and still look expensive online. If you do that long enough, your appetite gets hijacked. The mind begins to treat visibility as reality. It begins to treat other people's display as evidence that your own ordinary life is failure. That is poison. It is not financial analysis. It is emotional contagion. I have no interest in living that way. I want my financial standards to come from my actual needs, my actual values, and my actual idea of a good life, not from what strangers are renting on the internet. Now let us talk about debt. Debt is one of those subjects people either moralize too much or excuse too easily. I try to do neither. Debt can be sensible. A productive mortgage can be sensible. A business loan used carefully can be sensible. Temporary leverage in a sound structure can be sensible. But a lot of consumer debt is not productive. It is emotional. It exists because a person wants to feel now what he has not yet earned the capacity to sustain. The source says this very clearly in one of its best lines: every dollar of debt is a piece of your future that somebody else owns. That is exactly how I see it. Debt for identity is one of the most expensive drugs in the world. It gives immediate relief. It gives immediate symbolism. It gives immediate status. But the claim it creates on your future can outlast the feeling by years. A person walks into a store, buys things he does not need with money he does not have, and for a brief moment he feels improved. Then the statement arrives. Now he has not only spent, he has surrendered part of his future labor. The source even includes a confession of this pattern, acknowledging hidden credit card debt and purchases made out of outsized expectations rather than affordability. That honesty is useful because it shows how common the behavior is. Exactly. There is no shame in noticing the trap. The shame would be in refusing to see it. A bad purchase is not only about the object, it is about the aftertaste. And debt has a long aftertaste. People underestimate how emotionally corrosive that is. A nice meal bought with cash may be indulgent. A nice meal bought with revolving debt is indulgence plus future pressure. That second layer is what ruins lives. It steals room. It steals sleep. It steals the ability to absorb the next bad surprise. This is why I think a lot of financial life comes down to one simple objective. Keep room. Keep room in the budget. Keep room in your fixed costs. Keep room in your identity. Keep room in your expectations. Keep room in your mind. Because room is what allows wisdom to survive contact with reality. Without room, everything gets harder. A broken transmission becomes catastrophic. A layoff becomes terror. A medical bill becomes a moral crisis. A market decline becomes unbearable. A conflict at work becomes imprisoning. The source gets at this when it says, what are the odds that at least one serious disruption happens in your life? Job loss, divorce, illness, wayward children, recession. It answers essentially 100%. And when that day comes, the savings you have will be more valuable than almost anything else you own. Of course, that is adulthood. The world is uncertain. It always has been. The wise person does not pretend certainty exists. He prices uncertainty into his life. He builds a reserve. He saves before he feels rich enough to save. He leaves margin. He understands that one of the highest uses of money is not display but shock absorption. This is where independence becomes such an important word. The source uses that word beautifully. It says the speaker always viewed every dollar saved as a dollar of future independence purchased today, and that independence, not visible luxury, is the real flex. Yes, independence is the flex. The world tells you the flex is the car. The world tells you the flex is the watch. The world tells you the flex is the neighborhood. I think that is childish. The flex is being hard to corner. The flex is not being owned by your next paycheck. The flex is being able to wait. The flex is being able to turn down a bad deal. The flex is being able to walk away from foolishness because you are not financially desperate. That is real power, and it does not always require a vast fortune. The source makes another subtle point I admire. It says you can have very little money and still feel a form of pure independence, while you can be enormously rich and still be completely beholden to other people, their opinions, their demands, and their desires. That is profoundly true. There are billionaires with less independence than a modest person with low needs and a quiet life. If your expenses are enormous, your ego is hungry, your image is high maintenance, and your life requires endless approval, you can be fabulously rich and psychologically captive. I do not admire that. I admire enough. Enough is one of the hardest ideas in money because the culture on money treats enough as surrender. I think enough is wisdom. Enough does not mean no ambition. It means ambition with boundaries. It means understanding that you can want progress without letting progress consume your peace. It means refusing to let every gain become a new necessity. It means recognizing when more has begun to function as a stimulant rather than a support. The source says this in several ways, often by returning to contentment, lower material needs, and the power of desiring less rather than endlessly requiring more to feel okay. That is exactly right. If one person needs $10,000 a month to feel okay and another needs $1,000 to feel okay, his savings go farther emotionally. His expectations are less tyrannical. His gap is easier to manage. That matters enormously. People are always trying to get richer. They would do well to ask whether they can become easier to satisfy. That is not anti-ambition. It is anti-misery. Now, let me say something about income. People fixate on earning more. That is natural. I am not against earning more. I like productive work. I admire ambition. But income is only half the story. Income can disappear. Savings remain. The source says this directly. Income can fall to zero, sometimes unexpectedly, while the savings you have are what carry you when that happens. That is why I care so much about the gap between what comes in and what goes out. The gap is where the real power accumulates. A very high income with no gap is a fragile life. A moderate income with a consistent gap is a strong one. The gap turns labor into stored choice. Stored choice becomes freedom. That is the whole game. And once the gap exists, investing matters. People love to make investing sound like a genius contest. It is not, at least not for most people. For most people, investing success comes from simpler things. Participating, being patient, letting compounding work, not interrupting the machine, every time the world gets noisy. The source says extraordinary patience matters more than extraordinary returns, and that an average investor with above average discipline over a long time can do extraordinarily well. That is a fantastic sentence. It cuts through so much nonsense. You do not need to be brilliant. You need to endure. You need a plan simple enough to stick with. You need to stay in the room long enough for the math to begin favoring you. You need to avoid self-destruction. That is why simple investing is so powerful. A simple plan has a better chance of surviving your moods. A complicated plan flatters the intellect and then often collapses under human weakness. I have always preferred plans that ordinary discipline can actually sustain. That is where the money usually is, not in dazzling strategy inconsistency. Now, one more distinction matters greatly: the difference between being rich and being wealthy. The source describes this usefully. Being rich is what people can see in spending and visible lifestyle. Being wealthy is the unspent money, the invested money, the reserve, the independence. That is precisely right. Rich is the visible part. Wealth is the invisible engine. Rich gets attention. Wealth gives options. Rich can be leased. Wealth has to be built. Richness is often theater. Wealth is function. I would rather have function. Function lets you sleep. Function lets you make a decision slowly. Function lets you survive a mistake. Function lets you be underestimated, which is often useful. That is what money is for. Not theater. So let me bring this home. If you want money to improve your life, stop asking it to become your identity. Stop measuring yourself by people who are living inside a different script. Stop letting every raise become a new baseline of obligation. Stop treating debt as a harmless shortcut to feeling established. Stop assuming that if you are not dramatically wealthy, saving small amounts does not matter. Save because every dollar saved is a little more future you control. Save because room matters. Save because uncertainty is real. Save because independence is cumulative. Invest simply. Let patience do more work than ego. Protect the gap between what you earn and what you spend, and define enough before the world defines it for you. That is the key. Define enough. If you do not, the world will gladly define it as slightly beyond whatever you currently have. That game never ends. I do not want to live in that game. I would rather live in a world where money serves judgment, where savings purchase peace, where investing compounds quietly, and where success is measured by how little of my life is owned by fear, comparison, and obligation. That is wealth to me, not a number. A condition of independence, a condition of room, a condition of calm. And if money can produce that for you, then it has done the best thing money can do. It has made you less owned by the opinions of others, less owned by the need to prove yourself, less owned by bills, less owned by emergencies, less owned by appetite, less owned by panic. That is the return I would want. That is the return I think matters. Everything else is just noise.